Live from Washington, D.C., this is Balance of Power with Mathieu and Kailey Leinz.
President Trump says Iran called this morning. Welcome to the Monday edition, as the president tells reporters at the White House that Tehran still wants a deal, even after weekend talks failed and in fact led to a U.S. blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. I'm Mathieu, alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. Thank you for joining us. Kailey, this blockade is now 3 hours old. The president saying some 34 ships still have passed through.
Yeah, he suggested that was the tally yesterday, which would be a higher number than what we have seen over the course of the last 6 weeks, but even still remains far lower than what we were talking about in terms of the flows and vessels transiting the strait prior to this war. Interesting that he really doubled down on the issue of nuclear power for Iran. Of course, that was what he said was the sticking point in talks that were unsuccessful over the weekend. He says he now thinks Iran will agree on nuclear and that Iran's nuclear dust will be gotten back by the United States.
The highly enriched uranium that was said to be part of a deal at one point, Kailey, we just saw one of the more unique presentations in recent White House history, even Trump White House history, as he had DoorDash grandma deliver McDonald's to the Oval Office, reminding people that tax day is this week. No tax on tips is something we're about to apparently hear a lot about.
Yeah, of course, he'll be traveling to Las Vegas, Nevada later this week to tout that very same policy as he maybe tries to shift the focus, at least domestically, back to the affordability message we were promised when we came in to 2026 before a war was launched in the Middle East. That said, on the subject of affordability, we're still looking at gas prices well over $4 a gallon on average across the country due to the Strait of Hormuz in large part. And he even said in an interview over the weekend with Fox Business that could be higher come the midterms in November. Which
is not what Republicans want to hear, certainly frontliners who are running for re-election. No word on the McDonald's order. There were two pretty big bags, Kailey. There wasn't for the press. They brought them into the Oval, right? And DoorDash grandma followed them.
Yeah, maybe we'll have to look for a readout on True Social.
Couple of number two meals, maybe.
Delivered meal hit for President Trump. So clearly a lot to talk about today. Interestingly, though, as we're talking about all of this, the equity market at least seems to be looking through it, even in the face of high oil prices today.
Isn't
so let's
something?
Get the latest on financial markets now as we turn to Charlie Pellet in New York. Hey, Charlie.
Thank you very much. And here's what's going on. The Dow, the S&P, NASDAQ 100 index. Yes, the Russell 2000. They are all advancing right now. We've got the S&P up 29 now, up by about 0.4%. The Dow, as I speak, flat on the day, up 1 point, has been swinging between gains and losses. Little change, perhaps the key takeaway at this hour for the Dow. We've got NASDAQ up 0.7%. NASDAQ advancing 152, keeping it all in perspective. The S&P 500 index up 30, up by about 0.5%. A VIX below 20, the 10-year 4.30%. Gold is down $15 the ounce to $47.35 now, down 0.3%. West Texas Intermediate Crude WTI falling back below $100, up now by 2.8%. 99.29 on WTI. Barrel of Brent 99.75, up now by 4.8%. So again, recapping, U.S. stocks are pushing higher. Oil majors also advancing. ExxonMobil up by just about 0.1%. Chevron up 1.1%. ConocoPhillips up now by just about 0.6%. McDonald's shares down 0.7%. DoorDash up now by 4.1%. All of this after that DoorDash employee delivered McDonald's to the president ahead of the White House news conference. Joe and Kailey, that is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie Pellet checking on the markets for us, including movers that matter. Who knew that DoorDash was going to get a White House shout-out today? That actually seems to be happening a lot. It was Palantir that got the shout-out from President Trump just a few days ago. Yeah, with the ticker included in the True Social post. And everything. We're seeing the intersection of Wall Street and politics in a whole new way. And that's, of course, what we focus on here on Balance of Power, which, of course, has largely been dominated by geopolitics in the intersection with the economy and financial markets, specifically centered around the Strait of Hormuz, where all the activity is, or perhaps, Joe, more specifically, is not. As the president said, the blockade is in place. Of course, it's been about 3 hours now, effective 10 a.m. Eastern time. No vessels carrying Iranian energy products are going to be allowed through by the U.S. Navy.
34 ships, he writes, went through the Strait of Hormuz yesterday, which is by far the highest number since this foolish closure began. That was right before the president invited reporters down the colonnade to speak outside the Oval Office. And you heard Kailey already reflect what he was saying. We want to get to Tyler on this. She's at the White House right now. It's all about nuclear. And the president says that Iran called this morning to reiterate its desire to make a deal, knowing that J.D. Vance got on that airplane and he did not look very happy following 21 hours of talks that led to nothing, Kailey. So let's bring in Tyler Kendall live from the North Lawn of the White House. I don't know if you're getting any McDonald's over there, Tyler, but the president clearly was just as interested in talking about his tax policy as he was Iran. The markets are higher now. There does seem to be a sense that we might be back at the negotiating table soon. Is that how we should read this?
Well, according to President Trump, and as you both mentioned, the main headline here is that he claims that Iran called this morning and wants to make a deal. But again, it does still seem, at least publicly, that the sides are very far apart when it comes to the core of the U.S.'s demands. Of course, that Iran cannot be able to obtain a nuclear weapon, and then also what happens to the already enriched nuclear material. Before we can even talk about a longer-term agreement, though, we have to talk about this 2-week ceasefire, which, of course, includes the reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. President Trump said in these remarks that the timetable has not changed, that there will not be additional fighting. But of course, we've heard an escalation of threats on both sides today. As we broke last hour, President Trump threatening that any Iranian attack ships that come near the U.S. blockade could be eliminated entirely, in his words. And then you have Iran now threatening to hit Gulf state ports, as well as that IRGC statement that we got overnight that says that if any U.S. military vessel goes into the Strait of Hormuz, that would be considered a violation of the ceasefire. But as you guys wrapped up nicely, it does appear from President Trump that these negotiations are ongoing in a sense after what we had seen from over the weekend, which was a direct talks that didn't have that resolution that we know that this White House has been hoping for.
Well, and Tyler, obviously we know whatever happens in the Strait of Hormuz has wider ramifications beyond just the Middle East, including if you are China and buying a lot of that Iranian energy product that the president wants to make sure cannot get through. This is a question that has been percolating since this blockade was initially announced. What impact will it have on Beijing, especially as we're now, just over a month out from President Trump's scheduled trip there to meet with Xi Jinping?
And President Trump said, Kailey, that he knows that Chinese President Xi Jinping would like to see this conflict resolved, considering that we know nearly 80% of the barrels that go through the Strait of Hormuz ultimately end up going to Beijing. So it's going to be something to watch here when you pair that with the president's previous threats last week that he could impose a 50% tariff on any countries that are supplying weapons to China, though question still on exactly how the administration would evoke the IEEPA authority as suggested by the NEC director Kevin Hassett, though that's the same authority that the Supreme Court has previously struck down. But that appeared to be a message to China, perhaps to gain some leverage as they head into these trade talks next week. But it also goes to the broader issue that this White House wants to make clear that other countries need to get involved here, including, as the president said in these recent remarks, that we could perhaps expect some additional details tomorrow about which other countries may be assisting the U.S. when it comes to this blockade.
But no details on that as of today. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live on the North Lawn of the White House. Thank you so much. And as Tyler was walking us through some of what the president said, let's hear from him in his own words just moments ago about the Strait of Hormuz and Iran's attempt to control it.
We can't let a country blackmail or extort the world, because that's what they're doing. They're really blackmailing the world. We're not going to let that happen. And, you know, the amazing thing is we don't, can you believe this? We don't use the Strait. We don't need the Strait. We have our own oil and gas, much more than we need.
So let's get more into this now as we turn to Heather Conley, non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Europe and Eurasian Affairs in the George W. Bush administration. She's here with us in our Washington, D.C. studio. Heather, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. He says Iran is blackmailing the world by closing off the Strait of Hormuz. Therefore, we are attempting to close off the Strait of Hormuz, at least for the use of Iran. What do you think about this blockade strategically? Is it actually something that can be tactically successful?
Well, the president is right. I mean, the Iranians have used this leverage for the last 6 weeks quite effectively. And what the U.S. administration is trying to do is wrest that leverage away from Iran. And what we're trying to do now is in effect blockading the entire strait to try to wrestle that leverage back. So it's understandable. Now, will it work? And that's really your question. And we just saw about an hour before the blockade went into effect, a Chinese tanker did do a U-turn. But in fact, it's sort of closing off all trade, all traffic, because people honestly don't know how this is going to work. And I think we just have to watch the brave first ship that tries to traverse the strait and see how successful they will be.
Well, this is quite a moment that we're in here. The markets are in a great mood. Interestingly, crude oil's back below $100 a barrel since the president came out and talked to reporters. Heather, he said, we've been called this morning by the right people, the appropriate people, and they want to work a deal. They would like to work out a deal. Of course, we just got back from the negotiating table in a failed 21-hour session with J.D. Vance, Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff. Does the U.S. blockade change the dynamic enough to change the conversation at the negotiating table?
So, Joe, if I can interpret, I think what's happening is the Pakistani mediators are continuing to pass some messages. They're trying to keep some of these talks alive, and I think that's important. We need those open channels of communication. But quite frankly, we really need to understand now how Tehran is going to react to this blockade. And I said, honestly, we're waiting to see the first vessel that tries to, move and what happens. But as I said, I think this is it's just going to bottle everything up. And I can't explain to you why the markets are so positive right now, just because we are now starting to see really the last tanker that left, February 28th, is reaching port. You're going to now start to see some material impact in Asia as well from products and things like that. So I don't see a horizon right now for resolution. I see a pause. And now we just have to wait and to see how Tehran responds to this blockade.
I have to wonder if at least some of the market reaction is that the idea that this is not as escalatory a step as the president could have chosen after talks failed this week. And as he was previously, of course, saying that the entire Iranian civilization was going to be killed, that he was going to take out critical civilian infrastructure. He went with a blockade instead. Is that to say, though, Heather, that this can't ultimately result in more escalation, especially as we don't know what Iran's reaction function is going to be?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, I think we are just in a pause right now. The ceasefire still held. Now, when the two destroyers went through the strait, the U.S. Destroyers, Iran didn't react. The negotiations were still ongoing. I think that was an interpretation of we want to see if this can go. But really, we have to see whether this happens or not. And again, a blockade is not doing the convoy support and escorting ships. That's 15 vessels blocking things. So it's again the muscularity that it would take to really do those convoy escorts. And look, the president admitted we didn't finish all the small boats. We know that the Iranians do have underwater drone capability. We're not entirely clear what the mining situation looks like. So this is absolutely right. I mean, the least, I think, risk-taking for the U.S. military, for the Navy, but it's a stopgap measure. We'll have to see what happens next.
So what did you make of that post from the president? This came around 10:30 this morning. He talks about Iran's Navy at the bottom of the sea, which he says a lot. But he said, what we have not hit are their small number of what they call fast attack ships because we did not consider them to be much of a threat. I'm not sure why. But he says, warning, if any of these ships come anywhere close to our blockade, they will be immediately eliminated, referring to the drug boats coming out of Venezuela. If, in fact, we start seeing this type of activity, does the U.S. board a vessel like that or simply blow it up?
Again, great questions. And I certainly the military has been concerned about the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, these small boats, because they are, again, they come in fast.
Why didn't
they're
we hit
hard
them
to detect.
right off the
Well,
bat?
I think that there was a lot of attacks on the Iranian coast, softening those targets. Some of them could be in hardened bunkers. There's multiple threats. There's mines. There's the small boats. There's underwater drones. There's also, again, missile capability. You need a huge package range of military support to escort those vessels. And I think, again, we've done this in 1987. We conducted an operation. It just takes an awful lot of material equipment. And again, the military can do this, but at what cost? And I think this is exactly huge question marks. And again, the brave first vessel that decides to test this proposition one way or the other will be the biggest guinea pig we will see. And the stakes are enormously high for both sides, because if Iran gives up its leverage, it's going to be much more susceptible. And of course, as the president correctly said, this is really extorting the entire global economy. So something's going to have to give here.
Just quickly, Heather, on the thing that needs to give, it seems for both sides, it's the nuclear program that Iran does or does not want to be able to develop in terms of enriching uranium. Axios had reporting that the U.S. was asking for a 20-year moratorium. Iran wanted single digits. I just wonder if you really think that this is a gap that can be bridged and in weeks, not months of negotiation.
You're absolutely right. This is the hardest issue because the Iranians are not going to give the nuclear component up. Now, for the last 20 plus years, their civilian nuclear enrichment they were as a right to, as part of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But we have no trust and confidence in that. But for the United States to completely eradicate it would mean regime change. It would mean ground invasion. And again, both are at maximalist positions right now. I thought it was interesting. The president was very clear, no nuclear, no nuclear. We were giving them a 20-year, bridge. And again, if you don't have full transparency, though, how can you trust that? So the verification would require such an intrusive regime, and the Iranians will never agree to the intrusive regime. So that's why we have not resolved this really challenging problem.
Well, this is being framed as a very not good weekend for J.D. Vance, who, of course, flew all the way over there and did not meet even with a counterpart, only to find out that there was not a deal to bring home. He certainly didn't seem very happy when he was taking reporters' questions. And then we learned that Viktor Orban is packing up his desk after 16 years in power, which is remarkable to think that J.D. Vance went all the way over there. He lost this election despite an attempted false flag operation and the support of the Trump administration. What does that tell you about the geopolitics involved here with Hungary and the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, this election was huge, turnout massive, and the Hungarian people chose a very different path towards Europe. Viktor Orban had taken them away from Europe towards Russia, towards China, massive. I think this is just illustrating why we should not pick winners. To secure U.S. interests with any foreign government, you need to have great relationships with whoever comes into power because you are trying to advance your strategic interests. And you're right, such a senior person spending 2 days, multiple rallies. That's why we shouldn't do those things. And we, again, any American you would ask, would you want a foreign leader to come into the United States and say, this is the leader you should pick? You'd be, get out of here. And I think that was, again, rejected. They were pursuing a different path. And the Hungarian people, this was about an economy that has been stagnating for 3 years and a crony capitalism that had so transformed a positive Hungarian economy into the ground. So this was the people saying, no, it's the economy. It's how where I want to position myself. And it was a massive defeat because many in the new right look to Viktor Orban as the playbook for politics. And that playbook met economic hardship and corruption that the Hungarian people absolutely rejected.
I guess he'll still be available for CPAC, or maybe more so.
We'll see if he stays in Hungary. There's going to be some investigations into those corruption charges for sure.
Boy, a lot to talk about with Heather Conley today.
So much. So good to be with you.
Monday.
So glad that it's only Monday, exactly. AEI non-resident senior fellow. Heather, thank you for all of your insights here on Balance of Power. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz, and we'll assemble our political panel next. We've got a lot to talk about as well with Jeanne, Zaino, and Rick Davis. Just moments after hearing from President Trump in the Rose Garden about a blockade that is now almost 3.5 hours old. This is Bloomberg.
Oil back below $100 a barrel today, even in spite of the fact that there is a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz enforced by the United States Navy, effective as of about 3.5 hours ago. market seems to be looking through that largely, perhaps as it is looking to be encouraged by the idea that this could have been more escalatory in nature after talks between the U.S. and Iran failed in Pakistan over the weekend. The question, of course, is whether those talks are continuing or need to resume. And the president, when speaking at reporters, McDonald's bag in hand delivered from a DoorDash delivery grandma earlier, said that Iran actually called this morning, that they're planning to continue talking, including over what was the sticking point in talks this weekend, the nuclear program.
Iran will not have a nuclear weapon. And we agreed to a lot of things, but they didn't agree to that. And I think they will agree to it. I'm almost sure of it. In fact, I am sure of it. If they don't agree, there's no deal. There'll never be a deal. Iran will not have a nuclear weapon, and we're going to get the dust back.
The dust, of course, referring to the highly enriched uranium that sits in canisters purportedly deep below the surface of the earth. Now, we're watching the markets here, and it's remarkable. Kailey, as you mentioned, crude oil back below $100 a barrel, and the markets have shaken early losses. It was all doom and gloom in the pre-market. Even Goldman Sachs upset everybody with a disappointing earnings report. We're chugging higher now, and we want to assemble our panel for their take on how they are interpreting all of this. Bloomberg Politics contributors Rick Davis and Jeanne Zaino are with us. Jeanne is our Democratic analyst, democracy visiting fellow at Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center. Rick is our Republican strategist and partner at Stonecourt Capital. What do you make of this, Jeanne? This is a buying opportunity. Now we're 3.5 hours or so into a blockade with no clear direction toward a deal in sight. The president is talking about this casually with DoorDash grandma at his side and a bag of McDonald's, and investors decide it's time to buy. What do you make of it?
That's right. And did I hear correctly, Joe? Her husband's name is Leo, and he has a book on humility. And this is coming
that's right.
24 hours after Donald Trump's dust up with the Pope Leo and talking about humility. It's all too much for my brain to handle.
Can't make this stuff up.
You can't make it up. I think perhaps the market is responding like so many of us with a sigh of relief that the president has chosen this route in a blockade. And of course, the goal there is economic pressure on Iran. That is where Iran is most vulnerable. That's where they were most vulnerable before the war, and they continue to be. Because if you think about what he could have done, right? He could have gone into the island. He could have started bombing, all of the escalatory steps he could have taken. This is perhaps, I think, one of the best of the worst options, and they're all bad options that he had. On the other side, when you think about it, the United States, since our founding, has long been a proponent of free navigation of the seas, of moving commerce freely, not charging tolls. And of course, it's just stunning to stop and think that we've got a president who just in the last few days has been talking about potentially striking a deal with Iran to split tolls on the Strait of Hormuz. So I think it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but I do think the blockade makes more sense than what could have happened after these talks failed over the weekend.
Well, and when we consider the blockade strategically, tactically, Rick, clearly the president's trying to make sure that Iran has less leverage for future talks. And he says, those talks continued this morning. Iran called. They do want to make a deal over the nuclear program. That wasn't the case, though. For 21 hours in Pakistan, they didn't seem to be getting much closer to a deal. At least that was what we were led to believe by the Vice President, J.D. Vance. Does a blockade really materially change anything?
Yeah, it really must have irritated Donald Trump to wake up to the news on Friday that looked like Tehran had all the leverage and that they disrupted the oil trade globally in such a fashion that looked like they'd actually won out of this massive attack exercise that the president and the military did, frankly, incredibly well. So I think you see a whole weekend and today an effort by this administration to try and, one, get back the leverage, but two, to cast a different point of view in the world community to show that they're still in charge. And so the leverage they can put forth in the Gulf is to do exactly what the president has decided to do. He's blockading Iranian assets, not other assets, not GCC assets, but Iranian assets, ships that are moving Iranian crude. and some evidence that some of that is starting to work with over 30 tankers coming through the strait today, and more to go. So I can understand the optimism. There wasn't a rain of missiles descending upon Iran today. No ground troops trying to dig up uranium dust, and so, as Jeanne said, this was probably the least kinetic and the most productive commercially of the options that the president had to sustain a negotiating position. Because remember, this is all just about a negotiation now. This is not a war plan. This is not about winners and losers. It's about getting a deal.
I had to chuckle listening to Ron Johnson on Sunday morning television refer to Baghdad Bob. You can remember that far back. Rick, Baghdad Bob was speaking at that point for Saddam Hussein and talked about the infidels dying at the gates even as we were rolling through and, of course, taking whatever we wanted at the time. The Iraqi soldiers were retreating into the horizon. I'm just wondering if you read these remarks from the Islamic Revolutionary Guard the same way. There was a statement that came following J.D. Vance's news conference. Any military vessels attempting to approach the strait under any pretext will be considered a violation of the ceasefire. The region, the security of ports, either for everyone or for no one. Do you take the Iranians at their word, or are these two different conversations?
I think you have to assume everyone's positioning themselves to the best degree they can, right? And we see the sausage making process of a negotiation really playing out in incredible detail. I mean, the president loves to talk about the plan to get a deal done in addition to getting a deal done. And that complicates things a lot, because if you're the counterparty and you're sitting in Tehran and you're hearing the president say things attributed to you that you may not have said yourself, you've got to get in the game yourself in order to position it. And so this very well could be an effort by the Iranians to just try to get back into a negotiating posture that didn't result in any positive outcomes publicly in Pakistan this weekend. So, look, it's pretty clear this is not going to be something that's going to be, fixed in a couple weeks, like the president thought when he entered into these negotiations. But everyone's hope is they ultimately will result in some stability in the Gulf to allow commerce to flow unfettered, not to get taxed by the Iranians, and to actually say goodbye to a nuclear program that the Iranians have had going on for quite some time. So there is an inkling of hope that you could get across the goal line, the finish line on a deal with Iran at some point, but it won't be a short-term outcome, it looks like.
Well, so I just have to wonder if they're going to be shuttling the vice president of the United States back and forth to Pakistan. Jeanne, it was J.D. Vance who was given the assignment to lead this charge. And I wonder if we should view it, knowing that the first 21 hours of talks were unsuccessful, as him being named the point person, and if successful, something that could raise his political stock ahead of 2028, or potentially him ending up the fall guy if this doesn't end the way President Trump wants it to.
Yeah, I'm sure he has visions of Kamala Harris being appointed to deal with the southern border. That didn't turn out so well. And, it is the stuff that vice presidents have to deal with. That said, it was an impossible task to imagine that in a weekend they could negotiate this. This was the first high-level talks between Iran and the United States in almost 50 years. It took, 2.5 years to get the JCPOA ironed out. There's enormous number of issues to discuss. These two are so far apart at this point. So, I don't think it's a big surprise. Not to mention, let's just remember the last two times Iran went to the negotiating table with the United States, President Trump said we were negotiating and then bombed them. So there's not a lot of trust between these two sides. And I think another thing we have to watch out for is, does Iran retaliate? And I assume they will. And if so, how? People have talked about, how do you retaliate against a blockade? You smuggle, you try to put more mines in those waters. But another big thing they have going for them is their ability with China and or Russia to engage in cyber threats and cyber attacks. And I think all of those things in this asymmetric war are on the table and a real threat to the United States as DHS remains partially shut down.
Jeanne, I need to ask about the Jesus Post. The president was asked about it. We only have about a minute here. You saw this. He posted an AI image of himself as Jesus Christ, the healer. He was asked about it just now. He said, I did post it, and I thought it was me as a doctor. Had to do with the Red Cross. It's supposed to be me as a doctor, he says, making people better, and I do make people better. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, there's the post. Washington Post out with a story on this, saying Trump post appearing to depict him as Jesus removed amid backlash. Less than a minute, Jeanne. What do you make of this choice?
You know, Joe, often it's very common for us to confuse Jesus Christ with people from the Red Cross. So I feel the president's pain. You know, I think, yes, it's a first step to remove it, but he should also apologize to Pope Leo. It's a heck of a time for him to be taking on the Pope, given that a quarter of his voters in 2024 were Catholics, and they are going to play a big role in these swing states and districts, the 26 election. That's why he took it down, but still refused to apologize for this back and forth with Pope Leo. That he should do.
Reiterating when he spoke with reporters just a short time ago that the Pope is weak on crime, in the president's words. Jeanne, Sheehan, Zaino, and Rick Davis, Bloomberg Politics contributors, the both of them here with us on Balance of Power. And we have more ahead as we look at oil, perhaps not reacting like you would think to a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz.
At the White House today, a McDonald's delivery and new hope for a deal with Iran. We watched all of this unfold live as the president of the United States, in fact, took delivery of McDonald's food at the Oval Office. Even he made a joke that this might appear staged. DoorDash grandma brought 2 bags of McDonald's to give the president an opportunity to talk about tax, well, no tax on tips and his tax policies from the big, beautiful bill that are colliding with tax day this week, April 15th. Of course, the real conversation with reporters who had been summoned for this off-schedule moment was really about Iran, knowing, of course, that J.D. Vance had come back empty-handed following talks that also included Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff with the Iranians. No deal with, of course, the idea of a nuclear-free Iran being pushed back by Tehran. The president was asked about those talks and the future of a possible deal. As he received the McDonald's, here's what he said.
Well, he's done a good job, and Steve and Jared, they've all done a very good job. And I can tell you that we've been called by the other side. They'd like to make a deal very badly. We've been called this morning by the right people, the appropriate people, and they want to work a deal. They would like to work a deal.
So for more on the prospects of this phone call and of a deal being reached at some point, we turn to Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall, who is back live on the White House North Lawn for us. Tyler, do we have any more information as to who exactly the right people all are who called this morning? Is it direct contact between those who were present negotiating in Pakistan?
We're still waiting on additional details from President Trump's comments, Kailey, though the president certainly made it seem as such, as we've gotten more headlines over the Bloomberg terminal throughout the day that other regional mediators have been trying to keep these talks going, including Oman and, of course, most notably Pakistan, where the direct talks were held just this weekend. These comments from President Trump seem to give us our strongest signal yet that there is an opening for negotiations after the delegations departed Pakistan this weekend without getting to a resolution. And President Trump himself reiterated that the main point of contention, that sticking point, remains the future of Iran's nuclear ambitions, as well as what is going to happen to the already highly enriched nuclear material. Now, the president is saying that he feels that there could be some path forward on this, but we should also keep in mind that at least publicly, Iran has still said and taken that more hardline stance, though last night, Kailey, the foreign minister for Iran, did say that it's natural not to expect that an agreement could be reached after a single session and that it takes time to hammer out these more complicated issues. I will point out that President Trump said as of now, the timetable remains the same. The timeline, I believe, is the word that he used, referring to this 2-week ceasefire that is still in place, and the idea that both sides for now are restraining on attacks on each other, despite the threats just today from both parties that we could see that escalation if a ceasefire does not hold.
Tyler, the president was asked whether other countries would assist in enforcing the blockade. He said, we don't need other countries, but yeah, they will. And when asked which countries, He said they've offered their services. We'll let it be known probably tomorrow. Do we have any insight into which countries these may be, or any of them in Europe, for instance?
Well, this has been a back and forth conversation, as you know, Joe, as President Trump has been heaping on the pressure, particularly for those European allies, those in the NATO alliance, to help secure the Strait of Hormuz. Now, the United Kingdom came out earlier today, said that they weren't going to be assisting in this effort. But we also heard from the French President Macron, who indicated that we're going to see a coalition, a meeting take place later this week, where they and partner countries will talk more of the specifics. But the underlying theme appears to be that allies aren't going to commit those military assets unless there is a ceasefire in place. The French president calling whatever mission does appear a strictly defensive mission, that they are not a party to the conflict between the U.S., Israel, and Iran. And that's going to be really critical, because we know that President Trump has ramped up his threats that we could see attacks on Iranian attack boats if they come near the U.S. blockade. So how this is all going to fit together with the White House's broader plan to ensure that there is freedom of navigation with our allies, of course, remains to be seen.
Tyler, we should also note, as you speak to us from the White House, that on the other end of Pennsylvania, lawmakers are heading back into town today after a 2-week recess. Congress will be back. We understand war powers resolutions could be coming up in both chambers this week. Obviously, we know President Trump has the ability to veto those, so should he so choose, if they were to pass at all, which isn't necessarily a given. But how should we be watching whether or not more pressure is going to be added to this entire situation by the return of lawmakers who've been spending time in their districts or Disneyland or wherever else?
Right, quite the 2 weeks to be out of Washington and not faced with questions by reporters on Capitol Hill. Kailey, now, as you alluded to, a war powers vote would largely be symbolic. If it ultimately did pass both chambers, President Trump would veto it, and it wouldn't have that 2/3 majority to overrule that veto. What I would actually point you to is another potential vote that could happen once we reach the 60-day mark of the war. Under the War Powers Act, President Trump needed to notify Congress about potential military action, but that same law does mandate that after 60 days, Congress would have to weigh in a more formal way to authorize an ongoing operation. And we had heard last week from some Republicans, including John Curtis in Utah, who said that if this war does drag on beyond a longer period, then maybe he would like to weigh in and get Congress involved in a more formal way to the future of the war. Under the law, it says 60 days Congress has to get involved. The president could ask for an additional 30-day extension to bring it to 90 days if that's what's required to get U.S. troops safely out of the region. But that's really what I have my eye on, because after this 2 weeks is up, we are then going to be at the 1 week mark until we hit 60 days. And then, of course, as you both know, we're watching the funding fight and how perhaps appropriators could withhold fundings if they don't get additional information from the administration about how this war is going.
Tyler, thank you so much. Bloomberg's Tyler Kendall live at the White House, setting us up perfectly for our conversation with Rebecca Babin, the Senior Equity Trader, Managing Director, CIBC Private Wealth, with our eyes on the oil market. Rebecca, welcome back to Bloomberg TV and radio. You've been talking about living on borrowed barrels. And it's true. There's been a lot of oil floating around that we've been using here. Crude, you say, is not in a market that avoided disruption. We're in a market that delayed fully feeling it. So how can we justify, or maybe you cannot, crude oil back below $100 today? Even if there is a deal, it looks like it's going to be some time before it's codified. What do you make of this reaction?
Well, I think it's really interesting. And I think the paper market that we're seeing right now sell off a little bit is trading and in looking through the conflict to the resolution and barrels being back on the market and available for sale in a fairly short order. The reality of that scenario is probably a much longer timeline, even if we get those barrels moving tomorrow. We are looking at shut-ins that have taken place across the Middle East that will take weeks for the best case scenario. And for some countries like Iraq and Kuwait will take months to get back up and running fully. Then we have the shipping scenario. A lot of the ships that have been transiting or were transiting through the Strait of Hormuz have redirected themselves. They're looking at the Atlantic Basin. They're looking to the U.S. to go to China. They have to make their way all the way back around to the Gulf and then, most importantly, decide to move through it. And I think that's the key that maybe the paper market's missing, that the physical market is getting. It's not just about the ships leaving the strait, which have potentially upticked, as we saw from a headline today, but who's coming back in to reload? And there has to be confidence that you can come back in, reload, and get back out. And I think that's where the disconnect is can we get those ships back to normalization? And what does normalization look like? The physical market where dated Brent's trading at 134 tells you that's a little bit different than where the paper market's trading right now.
Well, and to your point about the production shut-ins we've seen, not even to talk about any infrastructure that has been damaged in the case of some LNG facilities in Qatar. Rebecca, what is your base case as to how quickly we could get back to the full production capacity we were at coming from the Middle East and these producers pre-war, assuming that there is eventually a reopening of the strait?
So that's a great question, and there's a lot of estimates floating around out there. The very optimistic estimates have about 1 month, right? And that's kind of the Saudi Arabias of the world who have great engineering ability, resources to put towards doing this. The worst case scenario, and we even saw some of the energy ministers at CERAWeek imply this when they were there a couple of weeks ago, saying this is like 2 to 4 months for us. That was Kuwait, right? And then we look at a place like Iraq where the resources and the infrastructure is more dated, and that could be 6 months potentially. Now, all of this is a continuum, right? You get some barrels back from Saudi Arabia and then it kind of filters through. But the bottom line is normalization. And we need to really consider what is normalization. If we have a strait that is still compromised or there's uncertainty, if we were getting 20 million barrels through before, maybe that's a lower number now as the freight rates across the globe have increased. And maybe ship owners are like, you know what, it's not worth that risk. I'm going to keep this other route going that I know is a sure thing. So you got to think about what's the new normal. But I would say on average, I think the number the market's using for production coming back online is 2 months. I think it's optimistic, but I think that's where it is.
Rebecca, the president was talking to reporters a short time ago, and he referred to many ships, he said, are heading to our country right now as we speak to load up with oil, with U.S. oil. They're coming to our country. He said right now there are many boats coming. It could be, well, that this is settled before they arrive. The market liked that last line, apparently, the idea of an imminent settlement or peace deal. But what do you make of what the president is saying here? This is an international market. To what extent could the United States be selling oil to more international partners out of this?
So that's a great question. Right now, U.S. exports are around 4 million barrels a day. We have the capacity to get up to 5 million barrels a day. We produce over 13 million barrels a day in this country, but we can't export everything because you have docking constraints, you have vessel constraints. So 5 to 5.5 million barrels a day of exports is kind of where the market sees our kind of capacity at. That does give us some room off of where we are at 4 million barrels a day of exports to increase. And I expect we see that. We are going to see inventory draws in the U.S. starting this week, and it's going to accelerate over coming weeks. And our exports are probably going to go from 4 to 5 million barrels a day. To realize that, again, we're talking about an increase of 1 million barrels a day. It's a lot, but in the context of what we're losing through the strait, it's just not enough to fill a gap, right, of that size. And this just comes down to the broader picture. We are using all of these different buffers, floating storage, SPR, inventory, increase in exports, to fill in a gap that's just, we're using a shovel to fill in a hole that's being dug by an excavator, right? So it's just really hard to fill that in. Are we pulling every lever we have? Are we talking the market lower? Yes. But if you look at the physical market, again, I come back to this, and you look at where it's trading in the Middle East and in Asia, and where you're seeing demand destruction based on the scarcity of supply, you just know that you're not filling that gap fast enough in the short term.
Rebecca, we just have 30 seconds left here, but there's a question as to whether Iran, in the face of a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, will then ask the Houthis to resume activity, disrupting the Red Sea. How much worse would that get for the energy market if we were to see that disrupted as well?
I think that would be very significant for the energy market. We have 5 million barrels a day being rerouted through the Red Sea out of Yanbu. It's been a huge release valve for the market. It's kept us from feeling that 150 in crude. And I think if we lose that, we're in really, really different picture, and it's going to be ugly.
All right, Rebecca Babin, we'll leave it there. Senior equity trader and managing director at CIBC Public Wealth, here with us on the early edition of Balance of Power. And we have much more coming up at 5 p.m.
Indeed. We'll meet you back here on the late edition of Balance of Power with $99 a barrel. We'll see where we stand later on Wall Street. This is Bloomberg.